Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video. And tuning is something that can make or break your experience in an expansion. And Blizzard posted before their most recent class tuning that this week would be the week that they are gathering as much data as possible in order to make class tuning adjustments across PvP, across Radiant, across Mythic Plus, which is why in today's video I wanted to take a quick glance at some of the data that has come through so far in all of those aspects of the game that are available to try and predict where I think that some of the specializations could be moving forward with regards to the selection of tuning that they are going to be making. So the first thing I think that's important to consider, we've got it here, is the scale of PvP, which is recorded by Drustvar, and you can see the specialization breakdown based on rating, and you can see right now that it's very hard to get even 2100. I posted on Twitter me unlocking my elite set on my Warlock and my Druid and my Mage, and people were like, oh, that's easy to get. And I don't think these people understand right now that 1800 is literally like the top of the ladder. It's not like Dragonflight Season 1 where everyone is 3600 rating within, like, I think the first month or something like that. It is a very slow grind. It's very hard to get ratings. So the majority of players are likely not even 1500, and I don't know if this website records that data. It says 1500 to 1799. So I don't know if anything below that shows up. So all we can really go off of is basically 1500 to not even 2400. There's not a single person who's even 2400 yet. And there's 5 players that are above 2100 at the moment. So we're going to do our best with that data. It does mean, though, that, this is going to be a lot of people, right? Like 1500, 1800 is going to be a lot of people, a lot of data for which specs are doing well and which ones aren't. So as expected, I think if we look towards the bottom end, you're going to see, the breakdown starts to make a lot of sense. Fire Mage just got really gutted before it came out, and it had tons of AoE damage with Living Bomb, which was super fun but also really powerful, right? Like, I saw you could kill an entire Battleground team with like one meteor in AoE, and obviously that AoE in PvE was strong as well, which I've got a graph here from Tettles, which has shown us where the classes are currently sitting in rating, which is where I'm kind of going off where are they going to make these tuning adjustments. So we're going to go back and forth between the PvP and the rating one. Fire Mage is very low. It's like in the bottom 5. So Fire Mage being this low in the bottom 5 of rating, and then also being this low in PvP, makes me think that they're going to have to rewind some of the changes that they made to it specifically, because 0.36%, if you play a Fire Mage, you're in the bottom 5 of PvE, or you're in the bottom 0.36% of PvP. And I would assume Blitz is also very similar for this. I think we can actually take a look at it, although Blitz is even harder to get rating in. Fire Mage is a little higher. You're at 1% in this, but it's still around the same ballpark. So whether it's PvP, BG's, Arena, Raid, it doesn't matter. I'm expecting Fire Mage is probably going to have to get some type of buff. I don't know if they'll just look directly at like their spells individually and just buff the numbers up, or possibly bring back some of the Living Bomb gameplay that it had before that was really making it super powerful, because right now Fire Mage is obviously, it's fallen behind this week as far as testing is concerned across the whole game. Now this is frozen on me for some reason. I want to go back to Solo Shuffle. The next one was BM Hunter, right? So BM Hunter honestly isn't as low as I anticipated for Solo Shuffle, coming in at 2%. It's actually higher than Arcane, which I thought was better. And Augmentation is honestly something that I expected to do a little better as well. But BM Hunter at 2%. The unfortunate, this is where things become a bit unfortunate, is that in PvE, Beast Mastery Hunter is number 2. So these two aren't lining up exactly, which means it's going to need like PvP specific tuning. And I think Devcom has been playing BM Hunter and telling me, I can't remember, I always forget the name of the talent. There's like some sort of talent like Cobra Collar or something where you basically put a buff on the target and buffs all your single target to that class, which is probably why in Raid BM Hunter is doing so good, because if you're just targeting one boss the entire time, you get that damage buff the entire time. But in something like Mythic Plus or something in PvP where you're constantly switching targets, that talent just makes the gameplay of the class just like not work at all. So either giving away for that debuff to like more frequently switch targets so that they can buff their damage to something else would help, or just to reduce the effectiveness of it, at least in PvP. But then I think in Mythic Plus it's likely going to have a hard time as well. So Beast Mastery Hunter I think was one that needed a little bit of attention. Demonology Warlock We can see this one down at 1.2% for arenas. Demonology Warlock over here is in the bottom 3. So much like Fire Mage, Demonology Warlock is falling quite heavily in both sides. So I'm anticipating Demonology Warlock gets some type of buff to just their core abilities, whether it's related to hero talents or not. I don't know. I don't have the breakdown of like which demo lock hero talent tree is the most selected of this 1%, right? But they could go down either just baseline buffing their damage or buffing the hero talents. Overall, just going to be bringing their damage up. Now, Arcane is still pretty low as well in Solo Shuffle. Frostmage is just so good and so accessible, right? Look at it at 600 games played. With most of its damage coming from instant cast, it's really accessible to new players as well. So it's just skyrocketing. It's strong in the hands of the best players, and it's strong in the hands of new players. So its numbers are just going through the roof really fast in this bracket, and it had a ton of people talking about it. But Arcane was also pretty good. Problem for Arcane was that you have too much casted damage. It was much like Affliction, but Affliction, they added in multiple schools of magic. So this is something that I would like to see for Arcane as well, is to convert Arcane Surge into something that isn't Arcane damage. Or just a different school. Maybe it can do Arcane damage or do something that's shared with Arcane damage. I don't even know what exactly that would have to be. That's separate, but I really think Arcane Surge being like the only hard-casted cooldown in the game just makes it entirely too predictable. And if you kick it, then you can't even do anything else. So I would really like to see Arcane Surge move to some type of other school of magic. I don't know if that's going to happen in a class tuning adjustment. It took an expansion for that to happen with Warlock specifically when they made Malefic Rapture a separate school from your other abilities. So I don't know, but I think that would be like one of the best things for Arcane. That's going to help new players that are on Arcane that are just getting spam kicked. It's going to help the top level as well, where they're constantly rotating interrupts on you. But Arcane in PvE is performing at the highest level. So again, like I don't know if they'll give damage buffs. So I'm hoping like PvP specific tuning wise, they make Arcane Surge its own school of magic, because those just aren't aligning at the moment for Arcane. Now, Augmentation Evoker is a bit of a strange one, because in 3v3, from people that I've seen playing it with like a Death Knight Augmentation or a Melee, that kind of classic 3v3 style, it's actually decently strong. So this representation, I'm wondering if it's like Devastation and Aug are actually both strong. People just prefer Devastation instead of Aug. Maybe Aug, I mean, Aug could be slightly harder to play. I think it is slightly harder to play. So it's like another decision as far as like picking, like, why are you playing Aug? Why are you not instead of Dev? It's like, it's easier. And then in PvE though, Aug is coming in at the bottom, and Aug in PvE, they've been trying to strip out of the God comp for Mythic Plus. So maybe they're okay with it being at the bottom. And you just, obviously I think Aug's DPS is supposed to be at the bottom because you buff other classes. Boomkin being below that, which we haven't got to yet, is kind of depressing. I think all the Boomkins, that's why Tettles is responding to this tweet. Boomkin being at the bottom is a bit rough. But Aug, I don't know if they should really do anything with it, specifically because I actually think that it is good. I think it's just people would prefer to play Dev because it's easier and people go path of least resistance, whereas Aug is actually strong. So his representation, again, is not like, it might not be indicative of the actual power of a specialization. It's just that people find it easier to climb as Devastation. Now, Boomkin at 2.6%, which is honestly higher than I thought. I got to like 1900 on it, above 1900. I was trying to get the rank 1 spot. I got close to getting it. Right now, it feels like you've only got Starfall build. And so if you're playing with classes that don't AoE, it's really hard to win. Your Star Surge damage is non-existent. And your survivability is really low, which are the same complaints in PvE. The survivability is very low, and your spenders don't do a lot of damage, and you just don't do a lot of damage in general. So this is a weird one though, because when you do play Starfall build, and even if you're playing the single target build, your overall DPS in PvP is not like abysmally bad. But I don't know what they're going to do with survivability as far as buffing this up, because Frenzied Regeneration now just doesn't heal for anything. I think for Druids, they think like, oh, you got Bear Form, that's your defensive, which it is still very strong against those specific classes that do physical damage, but against things like Death Knights and Bleed classes, like they don't care, they shred through it. And honestly, maybe that's fair, like, you know, that's the counter for Boomkin, but I could see them buffing the survivability of Boomkin if that's the main issue, but definitely the damage. They just have to be careful in PvP that they're not buffing damage related to Starfall. They need to buff damage that's related to Star Surge. And in PvP specifically, I'd like to see them rewind some of the nerfs to Starfire. I feel like that was fun to have a hardcast build, and now Starfire just doesn't feel even close to as threatening. I think, you know, over 2 million crits was too high, but now it's doing less than 1 million crits. So, you know, maybe a little bit like 1.2 million. That seems to be like the fun number for a spell to crit, is around 1.2 million damage. So making the Starfire Elune build go for 1.2 million. A little bit of a survivability buff. Maybe they buff the damage mitigation on Barkskin a bit or something like that. I'm not too sure specifically with that. There's a bunch of different routes they could do that, but survivability is definitely an issue. Whether you're playing at the highest level or, you know, beginner level, it makes it even worse for Boomkin specifically. Now, the top level classes, right? Frost Mage is crazy good, and it's just survivability, instant cast damage. I covered that. Affliction Warlock as well, just really good damage. I'd say its survivability, though, is reasonably balanced. When you get classes like Death Knights, Fury Warriors, Windwalkers on them, Rogues, which you can see have high representation, it's not entirely free to play Affliction Warlock. And Frost Mage has similar issues with things like Hunters and Rogues and Ferals, which have decent representation as well at this point in time. So it's not that they're uncounterable. It's just, mostly it's just the top end of Ice Lance and Shadow Bolt. I think if they took a little bit of damage out of Shadow Bolt and Ice Lance and put it into something else, like the dots for Affliction, like Corruption and Agony, don't really do a lot. And took the damage out of Ice Lance and put it into Frostbolt. These would be two good like damage PvP specific changes that would probably, you know, reward players for being a little bit more skillful, or as opposed to just, you know, revolving around these. But these classes feel really fun too at the same time. So I'd almost rather they focus on bringing up the bottom to the top rather than bringing the top down too much. Like I think they need to be really conservative, which brings us into our point of like, this is like make or break it moment. And there's moments like this where they're tuning delves because people were using groups for it and they want it to be solo content, and then they tuned it in a way that now people can't even like clear it, and people are getting really frustrated with this. And it's this type of like mismanagement of tuning that can completely set a game on fire. Something like Helldivers 2, for example. They have to be really careful when they're touching stuff like this, especially if people are having fun with it, because it can completely fry it. So I think for the most part, like PvP is really fun. I think people were having fun in delves. So doing any sort of like overhanded tuning and like sledgehammer changes is very dangerous. I want them to be very cautious with what they're doing specifically. Other classes that feel just decent, Shadow Priest coming in at 11%. I'm honestly surprised to see this higher than Dev, because I think it's honestly harder to play than Dev. But Shadow Priest is doing phenomenally well, and it's doing kind of bottom end on PvE. So Shadow Priest could likely receive some buffs. I'd honestly like to see maybe a little bit of buff to its damage and bring down its survivability a tad, because that seems to be like its main pain point. Ellie just feels average. I'd like to just see a small damage buff to like Lava Burst and Earthshock. Destro is honestly pretty good. I think it might just be overshadowed. But even a buff to Chaos Bolt. I think Chaos Bolt is definitely a spell in PvP that feels like it's a bit underperforming. Like that's the spell for Locks, right? Like when you play Destro, you're playing for Chaos Bolt. So that's the range DPS breakdown. We got healers, and look at that, Disc Priest. You know, it's completely dwarfing every other healer, which is remarkable because Preservation Evoker, for all intents and purposes, is the strongest healer. I think almost everybody agrees in PvP. Preservation Evoker does way more healing than any other spec. So the fact that Discipline Priest is 33% is interesting. And the thing is Discipline Priest has the highest representation in Solo Shuffle, I think, in every season of Dragonflight, even when it's not good. It is just the most fun healer. Everybody wants to play it. Maybe it's just a classic spec, maybe the playstyle of Atonement with doing damage to heal, but it's just generally the most popular healer, and it's strong. Like, it's a very close second to Preservation Evoker. Definitely, like, a very adequate substitute. So because it's powerful and it's just baseline popular, it's doing really well. But another interesting point is that other healers are very close to Preservation Evoker. Resto Shaman and Holy Paladin is the biggest surprise, you know? If you're within 5% of another spec, I think that's, like, decent balance, because you're never going to have it perfect. Some specs are more popular than others. You just never want it to be like 0.36% to 26%. Like, that's too big of a gap. There's always going to be a best spec and a worst spec. It's just about getting the gap as close to the other one as possible. And the healer balance is honestly like not that bad. I think, you know, bringing down some of Preservation Evoker's healing would probably be wise. Mostly their damage. Maybe bringing up Resto Shaman damage like Lava Burst, but its representation looks really good. Even Holy Paladin, which I thought was one of the weakest healers, is outperforming Resto Druid, which I didn't think was like the best healer, but I thought it would be better than Holy Paladin. Mistweaver still coming at 9%, which is also surprising. And then Holy Priest, which I thought would be better than Mistweaver, is even lower than that. So Holy Priest, let's see, what are we looking at? I think this is only damage though, unfortunately, and I don't know if I have a graph for the healing specifically. Now for Priest, I think in PvE the main complaint is mobility, which is honestly a problem for it in BG Blitz as well, which we can look at here. In BG Blitz, is it a similar story? Wait, I gotta cut this rank down. No one's above 2100. So Holy Priest, even Disc Priest, even in BG Blitz, I was expecting priests to just not even be existent because of their limited mobility, which Holy Priest is. But even Disc with limited mobility is getting really good representation in Battleground Blitz specifically. And you can see some specs like Boomkin start to jump up a lot more in Battleground Blitz, which I think makes sense. Again, the mobility of it and the utility and the CC that it has. So there's a little bit of balancing issues potentially between Battleground Blitz and Solo Shuffle specifically. But yeah, Disc is definitely performing up here. So I'm a bit worried about it possibly getting some like sledgehammer nerfs, like we just said. I think they need to be really careful with the nerfs that they're doing overall. Focus on these guys that are 0.5% and like less than 5%. As far as like buffs and trying to make them feel as good and fun as the guys that are up here, because these guys play and like I've seen nothing but positive feedback on people's experiences with this classes. They're having a lot of fun. So this is one of the instances where I think buffing the weaker is going to feel better for the game and be better for the game. Sometimes you have to nerf the top down when it's like one outlier, but it's not like, look, I mean, Frost a little bit, but like there's a lot of outliers towards the top. So I'd rather see like bottom up changes. Now Outlaw, unfortunately though, in PvE, you're a top 3 performer. And honestly, I think Outlaw Rogue is a lot better than this 0.5%. And maybe Outlaw participation will go up with the 11.0.5 patch when they make it easier to play, because Between the Eyes will be less punishing. Same thing for Enhancement Shaman, with all the quality of life changes that are coming through for it. Enhancement Shaman is also coming in at like the top 6. I feel like it's gotten PvE nerfs most tuning passes. Demon Hunter definitely needs a little bit of attention, coming at 2.23%. And in PvE, it's kind of low. So I could see on the reset, Demon Hunter definitely getting some significant buffs due to its representation across the game as a whole. And then when we get to this like 4 to 5%, maybe for melee, you might have to bring the top down a bit because there's a bit of a much more big gap between the top two to everybody else at this point in time. But this is a decent representation. Like usually Feral is very low. Rogue is usually like not at all seen. Even Survival Hunter's representation, like I don't think Survival Hunter is a super popular spec. Is not completely terrible. So like for me personally, and my assessment is like the game is actually very fun. At least in PvP, the game is very fun. You need to be really careful with what you're going to do as far as tuning, especially considering the tournaments are coming up. The tournaments are going to be like an advertisement for the game. We obviously want the tournaments to be as exciting as everybody else is experiencing the game right now. And I don't want what is going on with delves as far as tuning to happen here for PvP specifically. So I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of look at what's going on as far as the meta. If you want to make sure you're staying up to date with news related to the game, like if tuning passes come in today, which sometimes they do come in on Fridays, then make sure to smash the subscribe button. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.